Hello, welcome to China Now. It feels good to be back on your screens with yet another intriguing episode of your premier source of in-depth analysis and insightful discussions on the latest news and current affairs trends happening in China. Here's where we tell you all about how China works, how it thinks, and how it views itself and the rest of the world. My name is Makiza Latifa. Let's begin with China Currents with Lisa. There's a long list of topics tailored for discussion. It includes the US military's secret disinformation campaign, which has been exposed, and the World Health Organization's revelation of how they discredited COVID as a China virus. Also in this episode, China has issued judicial guidelines on imposing criminal punishment on die-hard Taiwan independent separatists. Let me hand over to Lisa at this point for the details of these and many other stories. Lisa, please.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report of what's happening in China. I'm Lisa. In this episode, the US military's secret disinformation campaign was exposed, and the WHO revealed how they discredited COVID as China virus. The second senior officials meeting of the Second Horn of African Peace Conference convened in Beijing. China issued judicial guidelines on imposing criminal punishment on the disheard Taiwan independent separatists. Thailand has submitted a formal letter requesting to join BRICS. $2.8 million from China is due to arrive in Kenya to assist in restoration from the recent floods. Record rains paralyzed China's southern cities, issue highest flooding alert. Let's start today's episode with a US misinformation campaign against China. Due to the promotion of some American politicians, the Philippines and China have been in constant friction in the South China Sea recently. However, a recent declassified document showed that in order to undermine the relationship between China and the Philippines, the US military even sacrificed the health of all Filipinos and prevented them from getting effective treatment from China during the COVID pandemic. According to Aretina's investigations, through phony internet accounts meant to impersonate Filipinos, the US military's propaganda efforts morphed into an anti-vax campaign. Social media posts decried the quality of face masks, test kits, and the first vaccine that would become available in the Philippines, which is China's Sinovac inoculation. At least 300 accounts on X, formerly known as Twitter, that matched descriptions shared by former US military officials familiar with the Philippines operation. Almost all of these accounts were created in the summer of 2020 and centered on the slogan, "China is the virus." The World Health Organization addressed this issue on the 20th of June, reaffirming the Sinovac vaccine is safe and effective at preventing severe COVID-19 and death. They told China's media outlets that spreading this information is a major threat to healthcare and provided detailed information supporting the safety and efficiency of Sinovac's vaccine. The US military's anti-vax effort began in the spring of 2020 and expanded beyond Southeast Asia and other developing countries. Tailoring the propaganda campaign to local audiences across Central Asia and Middle East, the Pentagon used a combination of fake social media accounts on multiple platforms to spread fear of China's vaccine among Muslims at times when the virus was killing tens of thousands of people each day. A key part of the strategy is to amplify the disputed contention because vaccines sometimes contain pork gelatin. China's shots could be considered forbidden under Islamic law. The South China Morning Post reported that the Pentagon, in response to a query about the Retiner's report, stated on Sunday that it conducts a wide range of operations, including operations in the information environment, to counter adversary malign influence. A spokesperson from Chinese embassy in the Philippines issued a statement criticizing the U.S. for undermining Filipinos' basic human rights of health and life by spreading deadly disinformation, despite its claim of respecting human rights. Manila's embassy in Washington did not respond to media inquiries about its awareness of a Pentagon operation. However, a spokesperson for the Philippines Department of Health stated that the finding deserved to be investigated and heard by the appropriate authorities of the involved countries. Some aid workers in the Philippines, upon hearing the U.S. military misleading campaign, expressed outrage. In the United States, public health experts briefed by Retiners on the Pentagon's secret anti-vax campaign condemned the program, stating it endangered civilians for potential geopolitical gain. They emphasized that an operation intended to win hearts and minds ultimately put lives at risk. During the campaign, the U.S. military's phony account amassed tens of thousands of followers. The full extent of the disinformation campaign by the Pentagon and the impact it may have had on COVID-19 death by dissuading people from getting vaccinated cannot be determined clearly. The WHO emphasized that using vaccine as a political weapon can have severe consequences. While a senior military officer involved in the program admitted, "We weren't looking at this from a public health perspective. We were looking at how we could drag China through the mud." Next up, a step forward for China-African relations. The second senior officials meeting of the Second Horn of African Peace Conference has convened in Beijing on the 24th of June. Senior officials and diplomats from the Foreign Ministry of Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda gathered to discuss regional stability. The initiative of peaceful development in the Horn of Africa is a solution introduced in early 2022 by China to assist the region in achieving long-term stability and development through unity and self-strengthening. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa Affairs of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs Xue Bing addressed the Security Council briefing on Somalia during the meeting. He emphasized the international community should adhere to the Somali-led and Somali-owned principle and avoid external pressure and interference or imposing any governance model. Xue also highlighted the challenges posed by recent terrorist attacks by al-Shabaab in Mogadishu and other areas, which have resulted in numerous civilian casualties. He called on traditionally developed country donors to respond to the Secretary General's appeal to close the funding gap and stressed that the international community should continue to support Somalia in building its security forces, carrying out counter-terrorism operations, and gradually taking over security responsibilities independently. Next up, on the 21st of June, Chinese authorities issued new guidelines on criminal punishment targeting deterred Taiwan independent separatists. In a notable provision, Article 6 specifies that individuals convicted of the crime of splitting the state may face the death penalty if their action caused particularly grave harm to the state of its people, or if the circumstances are deemed particularly serious. The document details clarify defined scenarios where a small number of deterred Taiwan independent separatists, through activities such as organizing, plotting, or executing schemes of de jure independence, or seeking independence with foreign support, or by force, should be held criminally accountable. Additionally, those who colluded with foreign or overseas institutions, organizations, or individuals in committing these crimes are subjected to harsher punishment. These guidelines take effect immediately upon release, a mandate that all relevant legal proceedings adhere to due process, ensuring suspects and defendants retain their litigation rights, including the right to defense and the right to appeal. Next up, a significant geopolitical shift. Thailand had submitted a formal request to join the BRICS group, marking Thailand's aspiration to become BRICS' first Southeast Asian member. Thailand aimed for membership by October, coinciding with the BRICS summit in Russia. Thai Foreign Ministry spokesperson emphasized that joining BRICS would enhance Thailand's role in South-South cooperation and global governance. According to a government statement, this aligns with Thailand's commitment to multilateralism and enhance the voice of developing countries. BRICS, originally comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, recently expanded to include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, Iran, and Ethiopia. Other countries such as Venezuela, Kazakhstan, and Belarus have also applied. Although the Bangkok Post warned that joining BRICS could harm Thailand's international standing and cause political concern, Chinese analysts noted that BRIC membership could offer Thailand new opportunities in investment, export, and technology. Thai Foreign Minister clarified that the move is not about taking side, but about economic opportunities and justice for developing nations. He reiterated that BRICS aims to foster a fair, multilateral global order, not confrontation. Observers highlight that BRICS expansion reflects the Global South call for greater cooperation and a fairer global order. Thailand could pave the way for more ASEAN nations to join. Next up, on the 21st of June, Minister Counselor at the Chinese Embassy in Kenya said 2 ships carrying 2,014 metric tons of aid are currently en route to Kenya's port city of Mombasa and will dock in early weeks of June. This aid from China, worth 370 million Kenyan shillings or $2.8 million, is to help with restoration efforts following recent floods that have devastated the East African nation. The latest data released by the United Nations indicated that an estimated 291 lives had been taken since the onset of heavy rains in March, which continued into May. The Chinese embassy also donated over $38,000 to the school in Nairobi slums, aiding its reconstruction after the April floods and the provision of desks, chairs, and books. In addition, every student will be given a new backpack to restart their studies. The China Embassy hopes that the students here will excel in their studies and grow to become pillars of strength for their families and the country. The floods caught us at a time when we were just about to open school. Director of Projects at Kenya's Ministry of Education expressed gratitude for China's timely aid. Next up, on the 24th of June, China issued its highest level flooding alert as torrential rainstorms have battered the southern parts of the country, particularly affecting the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze River since mid-June. Since the 16th of June, Hunan province had been one of the hardest hit areas, with almost 600,000 people affected across 14 cities and 58 counties. In response, over 300 excavators were urgently deployed to various reservoirs, holding back 660 million tons of flood water before it attacked densely populated areas. On the 19th of June, the Chinese government allocated around $50 million in emergency relief funds to ensure the supply of drinking and domestic water for disaster victims. Previously, a total of $14.7 million were allocated to support the urgent restoration of flood-damaged roads. As of 18th of June, 9,072 rescue teams, totaling 437,000 personnel, have addressed 23,000 incidents in Hunan province. The leader of the drone rescue team stated that they have used thermal imaging drones to search every collapsed building, leaving no trapped individuals behind. In Qiyang, the local village chief organized evacuations door to door and set up warning lines around submerged rice fields. After the flood water receded, he immediately organized villagers to recultivate the fields. On the 20th of June, China's Minister of Water Resources Li Guoying declared a resolute commitment to winning the battle against flooding and ensuring the safety of people's lives and property. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Current. If you have any thoughts or comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. And we look forward to hearing from you and see you next time.
And that's all for China Currents with Lisa. Next up is the Thinkers Forum, and our scholar for the first part of the show is the former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, who is also a renowned economist and politician. Now, according to him, the rise of the right in Europe doesn't necessarily translate into a bleak prospect for China's relations with Europe, but rather their survival depends on the trade relationships with China. Let's take a listen to this interesting perspective.
Well, allow me firstly to say that there is no doubt in my mind that Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, is an embarrassment for us Europeans. She doesn't speak for us. You have to remember, we never elected her. She was imposed on us by Chancellor Merkel and President Macron. Europe is not a democracy, whatever they may be telling the people of China. It's less of a democracy than China is. Think about it, two men and two women got together in a room and they decided that Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, a failed defense minister from Germany, the chancellor of Germany at the time didn't want to have in Berlin around her. She got rid of her and sent her to Brussels to be the president of the European Commission. And, when Ursula von der Leyen goes, for instance, to Israel and stands in front of the tanks of the IDF, of the Israeli army, cheerleading them just before they enter Gaza to kill tens of thousands of children, that just goes to show what I was saying to you, that she's an embarrassment to Europeans. Another point that I need to raise is that, you mentioned her trip to China and the de-risking narrative. That wasn't even hers. It didn't come from Europe. This came from Washington. It was the American instruction to Ursula von der Leyen that, you know what, you will need essentially to break your trading bonds with China. This was an instruction that came from the United States. Germany, you said something that I don't agree with. You said that the European right didn't want trade relations with China. That's not true. If you talk to any industrialist in China, they really want trade relations. Actually, not only do they only want trade relations with China, their survival depends on trade relations with China. They're nothing short of their economic life depends on Chinese trade. If you think of going back to 2008, when the American economy collapsed, and simultaneously the periphery of the European Union, countries like mine, Greece, Italy, they went all bankrupt. Suddenly, German industry had no one to sell their products to. If it wasn't for China, they would have died. They would have all gone bankrupt. So it was Chinese demand for German exports that kept Germany alive. And, German industrialists, even if they're very right-wing, know that, appreciate that. But they got their marching orders from Washington, cut trade with China. Ursula von der Leyen knows this. She knows that it is impossible for Europe to maintain its economic energy and to move towards the green transition, electrification, let's say, of transport, battery technology, without trading with China. She knows that. But she doesn't care, because Ursula von der Leyen, and this is a very controversial statement that I'm going to issue now, but I'm going to make it because I believe strongly that she doesn't work for Europeans, she works for the Americans. She works for the American administration, and she comes to China and tells you that which has been given to her as a briefing from Washington, D.C. And, if Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, knows that and dislikes that very, very much. Olaf Scholz is not in agreement with Ursula von der Leyen. Olaf Scholz, remember, he came to China. He brought German businessmen to give you exactly the opposite message, that we do not want to de-risk and to de-link from China. We want, but And here is the conundrum of Europe. Olaf Scholz is the elected Chancellor of Germany, and he has less power than the unelected President of the European Commission, who takes her marching orders from Washington. So should you expect a deterioration? Well, look, it's up to us here in Europe to rise up against Mrs. von der Leyen, who, by the way, is going to be reappointed again because there is a lot of support that she has from Washington, D.C. It's up to us Europeans, activists, politicians, citizens, to stop our European leaders from turning Europe into a colony of the United States, which the United States uses in order to up the ante, to intensify the new Cold War between the United States and China. We need an independent Europe. We need a Europe that minds after Europe and the world. Because if we do mind after Europe, then we will de-escalate the new Cold War that the United States is unleashing against China. And this is our job to do here as Europeans. What should the Chinese people expect? You should expect the worst, because Europe is not going in the right direction. You should understand that it's not the European people who are turning our politics against China. It is our rulers. We are not sovereign nations anymore. Here in Greece in 2015, the people of Greece decided to go another way. 62% of the vote was against the standard line, which I am describing now. And what happened was the people were overthrown. So we need international solidarity against very pernicious business interests who are trying very hard to foment the Cold War between East and West, between the West and China, the West and China in particular. We need to stop them from essentially undermining the conditions that would allow humanity to create a better future for itself.
Thank you so much. Talking about saving humanity, I know that are you still banned from Germany for standing up for Palestine?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. This is the state of affairs in Europe. Very briefly for you to know, I have taken the German government to the courts in Germany because they won't tell me. I was told verbally, not me personally, my comrades, my collaborators in Germany were told that I was banned by the police in Berlin, by a high-ranking police officer. And I was told that not only was I banned, I would be arrested if I entered Germany, but also that they would be arrested if they hosted me over video link, as you and I are speaking now, that if any German spoke to me in a public meeting over video link, they would be arrested. Now, this is like a statement by the German government, the German police, that totalitarianism is here and it is ruling over Europe. And so there is the small, tiny detail that supposedly we live in the European Union where there is freedom of movement, but my freedom of movement has been revoked by the German police, verbally. So my lawyer wrote to the government, to the Ministry of the Interior, and asked for details, and asked 3 very important questions, simple questions. Which authority banned me? When and why? And what was the rationale? And we got a letter a day later saying that they will answer us within 48 hours in writing. In 48 hours, we got a letter saying, "Dear Mr. Varoufakis, we are not going to answer your questions because that would go against national security." So I'm taking them to court in order to ascertain my right to know if I am still banned, who banned me, and why. But of course, the reason why they are delaying is because they're embarrassed. But imagine if they do this to me, given that I have a high profile. I speak to you, I speak to journalists, BBC, and so on. Imagine if they feel free to do this against me, to violate basic law against me. Imagine what they will do to people who do not have a public platform, who are not well known, who do not have my capacity to communicate these matters. Europe is becoming a very bleak place. They advocate human rights and the rule of law and do whatever they want, whenever they want, in violation of human rights and the rule of law.
Now let's move on to the next part of the Thinkers Forum. We are privileged to have Norman Finkelstein, who is an American political scientist and activist, and he's going to offer a unique perspective on the recent events, starting with reflections on October 7th and the shifting global opinions towards Gaza and Israel, as well as the impactful role of a student movement in shaping US policy, influencing public awareness, and their insights on Chinese diplomatic positions.
When October 7th happened, overwhelmingly, world opinion was on the side of Israel. Everybody condemned Hamas. Everybody condemned the events of October 7th, and everybody sympathized with Israel. There was no exception to that. But now we're 7 months later. Everybody supports the Palestinians. Everybody condemns Israel. Nobody feels any sympathy anymore for Israel. And my position was, and it remains, that clearly crimes of a significant magnitude happened on October 7th. However, I was unwilling to condemn the perpetrators of those crimes because I had too much knowledge of what the people of Gaza had endured for decades before those crimes were committed. I will not dispute that they were crimes. I will not dispute that they were crimes of a significant magnitude, but I will not condemn the perpetrators of the crimes. So if I were to make an analogy, I would say, let us say that you are the next door neighbor of a woman who has been battered and battered and battered by her husband. She screams and yells, and all the neighbors hear the screams and yells, but they don't do anything. She calls the police, and the police say, this is a domestic dispute. That means it's a dispute between the husband and the wife, and we're not going to get involved. One day, you, the neighbor, are returning home, and suddenly you see the house where that woman and her husband live. It's surrounded by police and by journalists. And you hear that the woman stabbed her husband 100 times with a kitchen knife. And then, because you're the next door neighbor, some journalists come to your home, knock on your door, and then they say, did you hear what happened? She stabbed her husband 100 times. She must have been a monster. She must have been a horrible, horrible, horrible human being. And that poor man, how he suffered. And then you see the headlines on the morning newspaper next morning. Monster woman stabs husband 100 times. Well, I'm sure you acknowledge stabbing somebody 100 times is a horrible thing. But you were there for 20 years. You heard the screams. You heard the yells. She tried to contact the police, and the police wouldn't interfere. They say it's a domestic dispute. So I ask you a simple question. She killed him. She stabbed him 100 times. She killed him. Honestly, I'm not asking you to agree with me. Would you condemn the woman? And nobody listened. She tried everything, and nobody would pay attention. So that was my dilemma on October 7th. I knew the details. I studied them very closely. I could not condemn them. And that meant I was not going to be in any television program, radio program, in any newspaper. I would say I have written the only political history of Gaza. Of the, how many people are on the planet? 7 billion, is it? Yeah, of the 7 billion people on the planet, I have written the only political history of Gaza. And you know, in the mainstream media, even today, after 7 months, if you were to do a Google search, go to New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, you take the entire spectrum of the mainstream media, you will see there has never been one mention of the book or one mention of me. Even though, as you know, I have a very high presence now on the social media. It is the only political history of Gaza, and not one mention at all. I consider that one of my greatest achievements. It's so funny. So in the United States, after October 7th, the limit was anybody who gets public recognition has to condemn what Hamas did on October 7th. That was the limit. If you didn't condemn, then you will not be recognized in the mainstream media. The International Court of Justice, which has many Western powers represented on its court, they would overwhelmingly, including the American judge at the time, Joan Donoghue, would overwhelmingly say that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. That nobody could predict. I would never have predicted that. I didn't. I thought the court would never do that. Students who have enormous challenges ahead of them. There is a weak economy. There is student debt. There is climate change. They have many political challenges. Who would have predicted that of all the political challenges confronting them, they would invest their energies and really make real sacrifices for the sake of a poor, powerless, and stateless people halfway around the world, namely the people of Gaza. And it was not predicted by me, for sure. Whether what Hamas did on October 7th was a wise thing or a stupid thing, whether it was a necessary step towards ending the horror in Gaza, or whether it was a totally criminal act, I have been reluctant to pass judgment. I kind of think it should be up to the people of Gaza to decide whether what happened, not just on October 7th, but for the past 7 months, we still may be closer to the beginning than to the end of the conflict. It's for them to decide whether it was worth it. Gaza has been turned into a parking lot. Israel has destroyed everything. It is so pulverized, so reduced to dust, that a large number of people not only don't have a home to go back to, but they have no idea where their home was. If you imagine your neighborhood where you live, where it's all reduced to rubble, let's say an atomic bomb were dropped in your neighborhood, and it's all rubble. It's just pebbles, stones, dust. Could you find your block where you lived in that rubble? That's Gaza. And it's going to be for the people themselves to decide whether it was worth it. I don't want to pass a judgment on that. There's no question in my mind that the student movement played a critical role in forcing President Biden to adjust his policies, which up until the emergence of the student movement were enabling the Israeli genocide with no restrictions whatsoever. The student movement posed a very big problem for President Biden for a very simple reason. It catapulted the anti-genocide movement to a new level of public awareness. Obviously, there was public awareness about Gaza before the student movement, but the student movement raised it to a new level, the public awareness. And the second thing was students represent votes. And this is a presidential year. And Biden was being informed by his pollsters, the people who predict voter turnout and predict who will win, that these student demonstrations were doing real damage to the base of the Democratic Party. That large numbers of young people, and not just young people, were not going to vote for him because of what's going on in Gaza. And it was the student movement which, let's just say, it brought the issue to critical mass. Obviously, there was a lot of concern before, but the student movement raised it to a new level and forced Biden to reconsider his policies. I personally thought that he would make the adjustment, Biden, at New Year's time, because I felt he thought he needed at least a year to get on board with the anti-genocide movement. What happened was he and his campaign managers decided they needed half a year, that by June, with the election 5 months off, we really have to end this Gaza thing because it's causing us too much damage. They didn't believe that in January. In January, they thought they could still go on. People, and the war will end maybe in June, and people will forget because people do forget. It's true. And then the argument about Biden being a lesser evil to Trump would set in. Obviously, there was a lot of awareness before the student movement. Obviously, there are many factors involved. Biden's decision. There is the International Court of Justice. There is the International Criminal Court. There is European allies. There's the Security Council. all over, there were sharp criticisms of Israel and the United States because the US was enabling it. But I think the factor that put it over the top or caused critical mass was the student movement. Now, I would say, just as a side note, I always listen closely to the Chinese representative. Frankly, I think at this point, everyone recognizes what the Chinese say is probably the most significant statements now coming out of the Security Council, because the others are predictable, whereas the Chinese, you're looking for every choice of words to see exactly where they stand. But their position has, both in my opinion, the Ukraine and also in Gaza, their position has been very reasonable in my view. In any event, the student movement will inevitably die out during the summer because schools are out, campuses are empty, and it's too soon to say what things will look like.
And that's all for the Thinkers Forum. Let's continue the show with the Global Arena featuring Jeffrey Sachs, who is an economics professor and the director of the Sustainable Development Center at Columbia University. In this segment, he makes mention that Taiwan is unequivocally a part of China based on historical and diplomatic agreements. He also argues against U.S. interference in Taiwan's affairs, warning that such actions could provide conflict akin to what happened in Ukraine.
First of all, Taiwan is part of China. Unequivocal, no question, no doubt. And by the way, that is true in the views of both sides of the straits. That was never an issue. Then, when the United States established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, they said unequivocally one China policy. This was not ambiguous. Then in 1982, when the famous communique was issued about Taiwan, the United States said, we have no intention of arming Taiwan for the long term. We will continue to provide arms to Taiwan, but on a diminishing basis that will be phased out. People can read the communique from 42 years ago. This is not ambiguous. The United States should not be interfering, especially, by the way, in my opinion, for Taiwan's well-being, because it makes things much more dangerous for Taiwan, for the United States to be taking unilateral actions. And I have many friends in Taiwan, and I admire many, many people and institutions in Taiwan. When I was in Taipei, I said to my friends, don't become like Ukraine. Ukraine is in war now because it's a proxy war between the US and Russia. I think that some understand it and some don't. By the way, older people tend to understand it more. Younger people to understand it less. And there's something very dangerous they don't understand. The US violates all of our diplomatic commitments. It violates our communiques. It violates Taiwan's own interest. It's provocative. It's interference in the internal affairs of China. To make Taiwan safe, in my view, the United States should say, there is one China, but we call for peace. We call for peaceful relations across the straits, but we are not going to get involved. We're not going to meddle. We're not going to send arms. If the People's Republic of China asks us not to have a delegation go to Taiwan, we respect that because that is one China. We do not want to be a provocation. We want good, open relations, and we want peaceful relations across the straits, which I do believe is a universal value, and I believe a Chinese value as well. But that means don't arm Taiwan to the teeth. That's provocation. That's what happened in Ukraine, which is we told the Ukrainians, we have your back. You're absolutely safe. Don't worry about it. You should become part of NATO. And the Ukrainians believed it. And I tried to tell them, by the way, for many years, listen, I'm getting to be an old guy. I remember Vietnam. I remember Iraq. I remember Syria. I remember Libya. Don't fall into this trap. And you know what? They said, we don't believe you, Professor Sachs. We have the U.S. on our side. I said, oh, don't end up like Afghanistan. The U.S. said, oh, we're on your side. And we left Afghanistan in ruins after 40 years. I said, you're going to suffer the same fate in Europe, to be like Afghanistan in Europe. Don't let it happen. Be prudent. Be careful. They didn't understand that. They sided with a U.S. interventionist agenda for the U.S. to move NATO into Ukraine against Russia's security interests. And this was a huge mistake.
And here's where we draw the curtains on today's edition of China Now. It is always a pleasure coming your way every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. with happenings in China and across the globe. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to share with me comments, suggestions, and feedbacks through the email provided below. And my team and I will gladly implement them to make the show even greater. My name is Makiza Micheline Latifa, and I'll see you same time next week.